So we're back with Graham Ward's testimony, and there's more confusion over job roles, particularly who would request witness statements from Fujitsu, in both terms of casework management roles and investigator roles. That's not clear, both of which Graham Ward has held in his time at the post office. But also there's some confusion about whether you would always request a witness statement from Fujitsu, even if you requested the data, which, considering nobody at the post office can understand the data by their own admission, would seem like a fairly critical component of any case. But the one thing that stands out here, particularly from a technical point of view, is that the importance of the message store data that Fujitsu have, that appears to be omitted at times, doesn't seem to be really realised by the post office at all, and how crucial it could be to their prosecution cases, both in terms of actually prosecuting them if a crime has happened, or indeed exonerating the person accused if the crime hasn't happened. Let's jump into the inquiry.
Okay, we'll move on. You said that it was for legal services to decide whether, I think, a witness statement was required. Did I understand you correctly there?
No,
or not?
sorry, that wouldn't be correct. Obviously, if
It would obviously be up to the investigator, and this to me kind of shows, I mean, it's either a bit of a slip up in terms of recollection, or it's a bit of evidence to show that they didn't actually really know how to run investigations at all, because, even in cases like this that, for example, the police would deal with, no matter what other evidence they've got, they would still gather all available evidence, because if it's challenged in the future, if somebody appeals, if somebody changes the confession, if somebody won't give evidence in court, if suddenly the data becomes even more important because a new charge is added, or the evidence that you are providing that you've already obtained is no longer relevant because you're dropping a charge, or you're dropping it to a lesser charge. There's just so many reasons why you need to gather all available evidence, not only so that you can actually ensure that you only convict people of crimes they commit, which is a really important point, but so that the evidence is always available based on the evolution of the case. Cases that go on for appeals and etc., can go on for years and years and years. You need to gather all the available evidence whilst it's still available. We know from previous testimony that Fujitsu delete the data after 18 months as part of the data retention policy. So this is a massive oversight.
so it's having not been an investigator for quite a long time, I'm struggling as to the actual process that they would have followed. But my sort of instinct would be that if they had requested audit record query data, so they had the data, they would ask for the witness statement to support it at that time, so that it could be presented to the criminal law team to advise on whether there is, charges to be, or there's evidence for prosecution.
And so
that would make sense, obviously, because the ARQ data in and of itself is no good on its own, because nobody at the post office can interpret it based on the lack of training. So they would need the supporting witness statement from Fujitsu, because presumably they understand it.
Your understanding was that if a request for ARQ data was made, it was a necessary corollary of that, a necessary bolt-on to that a witness statement had to come with it too.
If it was asked for, yeah. Wouldn't necessarily, I don't know whether, it's difficult to remember, to be honest. Yeah.
Looking at this flow chart, both sides of it, this doesn't mention the message store, does it? If you look at it.
Yeah, it does on the left-hand side. It says generate message store. Or am I misunderstanding the question there? Let's see how he answers.
On the left-hand side, audit record query request. It's got generate message store.
So what does that, to your understand, mean? Generate message store.
Sorry, I don't know what it means.
Were you aware of something called the message store?
I mean, obviously the word generate means to create something. So are we retrieving evidence? We can understand the create next to create audit trail of request, because they're basically saying then let's create the report. But you'd expect everything else to be select, retrieve, query, complete, exhibit labels for stuff. You wouldn't expect to see any generation or creation of audit records. They have already been created. So it'll be interesting to see what his understanding of the message store is from the post office point of view.
No, it doesn't ring a bell with me, no.
Something that had more data on it than was available than simple ARQ data. Were you aware of that?
No.
So presumably, rather than creating more audit records of any description, I don't just mean the audit record query that Fujitsu identified, but audit records are almost footprints of things that have gone by already. So creating additional ones should only happen through actions of users on systems. But if we presume the generating the message store, the creation here is almost some summarization with additional information, the potential weakness you've introduced into the process here, rather than just handing over raw records, is that there's the potential for more bugs here. I mean, nobody's discussed this yet, but if you are taking... There's a potential for bugs in a system, which leads to audit records, even if they are being recorded correctly, not accurately reflecting what's happened due to an error in the system. You've got a second possibility of an error when audit records are creating, i.e. an audit record is creating that doesn't actually match what has happened or who's done it necessarily. And now it appears we've got a third point of failure potentially, almost generating some kind of summary or additional report based on audit data. And if that isn't coded correctly, then you can potentially have this summary which doesn't match the actual audit records that are there, even if there wasn't errors in the system or errors in the audit record query process itself.
Were you aware of something called the event log?
Yeah, I mean, that came as part of the ARQ. So the transaction log was all the transactions conducted at the counter. The event log was logging on, logging off, cash declarations and balance results. Probably other things as well, but I know there was two logs that came with an ARQ.
So just some final thoughts on this message store. It's not abundantly clear from the testimony what extra data would be provided or what benefit there is to getting message store, the message store as they call it. So far, if I was to try to hazard a guess, message store is maybe... rather than it being split out, which seems a separate process into separate transaction and event logs, which is probably to make things more easier to track, easier to diagnose. Obviously, if you're not interested in events, you merely want to see every transaction that's gone through, you can go straight through to the transaction log. Presumably, the message store, a messaging computing terms, would be messages, almost if you think about it like emails between computers, about anything that's happening on the system, potentially in a raw format. It would basically be saying, well, the transaction and event log data, yes, has been generated by the system, but it's supported by these raw messages, which would usually contain a lot more technical information necessarily. Response codes, IP addresses that have been sent from, data that wouldn't generally be useful to, certainly not to a casual user, but for most people's day-to-day roles in Fujitsu, they'd usually be most useful for tracking bugs and errors in terms of development teams and software engineers. It's the potential that the message store underpins all the additional event logs and transaction logs that are generated based off that information. The interesting part would be that obviously the message store itself, if it is a raw content of all the messages transmitted between the subpostmasters Horizon system and any central databases, data centers at Fujitsu, that actually it contains extra information, some of which may not be relevant, but actually may shed some light on the operation of the system because it includes further technical details. So For example, when you see an error message on your screen of your computer, that isn't the raw message that is logged at computer level. That is a user-friendly way of interpreting said data. Now, obviously, we've mentioned that there could be some errors in that process in and of itself, but more key, there's probably information that's omitted. And these raw logs go to many thousands of pages, because it literally should contain essentially a data dump of everything that's happened, any issues, any alarms, and a lot of additional technical detail, which isn't normally required in the day-to-day operation of the system, but could certainly become critical in any prosecution case. Because whilst non-software development and engineer professionals might not be able to interpret it, clearly by the time it's going to a court, they will be able to get expert witnesses to testify as to what it was saying. So it would be crucial to provide that, as well as disclose that to legal teams, because of course then that actually would give them the option of consulting with a software professional, a technical professional, to be able to interpret the logs to check that they match what is A, being accused of their client, but B, that it actually matches the evidence, the ARQ data evidence that they are relying on for these cases.